I'm really delighted to be introducing Michael O'Hanlon today. When I was covering the Pentagon for the Washington Post back during the Clinton and Bush years, Michael was someone I sought out frequently for his perspective on military and foreign affairs. And so did many of my journalistic colleagues. And that's because Michael not only knows a lot, but he also has a particular knack for explaining complex things clearly and often with the pithiness that journalists love to quote. He's been at Brookings specializing in national security policy for just over 2 decades now. And before that, spent 5 years at the Congressional Budget Office. So he's really immersed in his subject. And he's quite a prolific writer, turning out books at the rate recently of about one a year, plus countless op-ed pieces. Actually, someone has counted his op-ed pieces, which number in the several hundreds. And I read somewhere that he's appeared on TV or spoken on the radio about 2,000 times since the September 11th attacks. Michael's new book, The Future of Land Warfare, was written with an eye on the 2016 presidential campaign. Hopefully, before we all go to the polls and actually vote this fall, the candidates will get around to discussing some critical military issues, like how much should we be spending on defense, what size should our armed forces be, and how should they be shaped. It's become fashionable in some defense circles, particularly in the wake of America's costly, poorly managed occupations of Iraq and Afghanistan, to argue that the era of such large land operations is over. And the argument goes that we should scale back our conventional ground forces and focus more on such capabilities as drones, cyber weapons, and special operations troops. Michael believes otherwise, and in his new book, he makes a strong case for maintaining a sizable army, because given the uncertain state of the world, we may end up needing large numbers of ground forces after all. As always, Michael makes a very compelling case for what he believes. So, ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Michael O'Hanlon.
Brad, thank you for the kind introduction. Thanks to all of you for coming out on Sunday afternoon, springtime Sunday, football season, and you're all very kind to spend a little bit of time. And I'm very lucky that I'm not Tom Lippman, who's doing the 5 p.m. speech. But although I think in other ways I wish I were Tom Lippman. He's a brilliant author, and I certainly recommend anybody who wants to make a day of not watching football should return. Thank you for the introduction. Very kind, but also very well framed in terms of the subject that I'm trying to get at. And that makes my job a little bit easier. What I'd like to do is not, of course, give a full synopsis of the book, but try to take a certain angle at this question, just to set up a conversation that I'll look forward to having. And as Brad said, I'd like to think of this as 2 separate overlapping sets of conversations or themes. One of them is the future of land warfare. The book's title, the book's subject. And here I'm thinking 10, 20, 30 years into the future. I'm trying to think globally, not just about America's own decisions on the use of force, although that certainly is part of it. And that's one big piece of the subject. That's the immediate topic. But I'd also love to talk about the presidential race and how defense issues should or are playing. And so feel free to offer your thoughts as well as your questions when we get to that stage. But let me begin with the following. First, the motivation to sort of beef up a little bit and develop a little bit of the point that Brad alluded to about why I'm concerned, why I decided to write the book, and then also tell you a little vignette about a visit I had recently to West Point, which was my last previous talk on this subject, and what I learned there from the cadets, which I thought was actually quite interesting and relevant here. And then talk just a little bit about some of the scenarios, some of the kinds of operations that I think we might wind up seeing ground forces carry out in the future. So that's what I'd like to do to begin. So by way of motivation, why I'm concerned, you never want to take page 17 of a given defense document too seriously. And my good friends like Barry and a few others who are here and Bob have been through dealing with various government documents over the years. And while we don't want to ever trivialize or ignore what's in an important government document, you don't want to take every word too literally or assume it has too much dramatic effect and purpose. But there were some words that President Obama asked the Pentagon to put into two documents in 2012 and 2014 that seemed like they were capturing the moment of where America's sensibilities were as a nation on Iraq and Afghanistan and anything that would look like them in the future. Certainly captured where the president was in his thinking about, I think, a fair amount of frustration with these conflicts. And even though President Obama ultimately or first tripled U.S. forces in Afghanistan before he gradually brought them down, and even though he's now going to hand that war off to his successor, we're not calling it a war anymore, but he's going to hand off 6,000 or so U.S. troops, so he will have been the only president in U.S. history to inherit a war, do 2 terms in office, and then have that war still going on when he hands it to the next guy. Even though all that's the case, you have to wonder, can we really be quite so clairvoyant as what was said in these documents? Because here is the phrase that captured my attention and my concern. And what we said in those documents, one of them was called the Defense Strategic Guidance. That's the 2012 version. The other one was the 2014 Quadrennial Defense Review. The Pentagon said, or by directive from the President, the Secretary of Defense instructed the military services no longer to plan or size the ground forces, really the whole military, but specifically the ground forces, for prolonged, large-scale stabilization missions. So there's a big difference in my mind between how you feel about a specific conflict and whether we have to get involved or not, and whether you keep a capability in the U.S. military for potential scenarios down the road. I have no problem with Mr. Obama's frustrations. I understand them. I've probably been slightly more supportive of these wars than he wishes he had been. He was a supporter, too, as it turned out. He stayed in Iraq longer than he had said. Now we're back. But also, especially on Afghanistan, he really did try to be the skeptic, but ultimately supported a big troop increase and presided over the surge there. And I think he probably feels that the outcome and the results weren't what he hoped for, weren't as good as he wanted. So he was frustrated. And I have no doubt that there's a validity to that perspective, which also reflects a lot of the American public's view. So it's one thing to say, let's not go ahead and do the same thing in Syria or wherever. But Mr. Obama went further than that. He said to the military, don't size the forces and don't prepare the forces so much for this stuff anymore. Yeah, you can keep a few people, keep a few colonels somewhere off in some distant war college who still remember how to do this, let them write a few books, maybe have some Pentagon manual that still tells you how to do it. But basically, the people that you bring into the military, you're not going to have as many to do this sort of thing, and you're not really going to train them to do this sort of thing anymore. We're going to go back to the old-fashioned way of preparing either for the big wars or, as Brad said in the intro, the new concepts, cyber, special forces, space, etc. And I would like to see us do as much as we can with those kinds of means. Don't get me wrong. I'm not in favor by some innate self-flagellation or flagellation desire towards our men and women in uniform to send them off into a lot of other places. I just think we may wind up in situations we don't have the choice. And so the basic idea that Mr. Obama had to the Pentagon was, don't do this stuff, don't prepare for it. Well, here's the problem. When you tell the U.S. Army, and with apologies to my good friends in the audience who have been in the Army or are today, when you tell the U.S. Army, don't get ready for this messy stuff, there is a big part of the Army's collective brain that says, thank you, because we don't like it either, and we don't want to do it. Now, you don't get that as much from today's mid to higher level senior officers, because they've been through it and they've thought a lot about the nature of today's Middle East, and many of them are, of the view, it sure would be nice not to have to go on another deployment myself or see my soldiers go, but some of these problems are a little bit harder to solve with other means than one might prefer. But historically, institutionally, the U.S. Army has loved the idea of being able to prepare for the big one and fight the way men are supposed to fight. Men and women are supposed to fight with big tanks and with, high technology. And there's a part of the Army that loved shifting like that after Vietnam. And so as good as the Army got in doing high-end warfare after Vietnam, when we decided we weren't going to do this kind of messy conflict any longer, it left us unprepared for Iraq and Afghanistan, which is part of why it took us 3 to 5 years to get good at the kind of fighting that we ultimately needed to do to be successful there. Now, you might say, well, it wouldn't have been nice just to realize we don't need to do Iraq and Afghanistan. We shouldn't prepare for these kinds of wars. And you know, we were right in the first place. Well, that's fine to say now in 2016. But I'll remind you that as much as the Iraq War was controversial, the Afghanistan War was not. The Afghanistan War was something that both parties have been strongly supportive of until the last 3 or 4 years when we got collectively frustrated. So you could say our hindsight has been skeptical, but at the time we had been attacked from a sanctuary in Afghanistan, or at least that's where the planning occurred. And we decided as a country it was pretty important to do this, even though we weren't ready for this kind of mission. So being underprepared didn't keep us from doing it. It just made us bad at it when we started. And so what I would submit to you is, even though we should continue to retain our skepticism about any particular specific intervention, we need to have some of the capabilities. So that's what got me thinking and got me worried, that President Obama was telling the Army and the military in general, don't do this stuff. And the Army is going to hear that message and say, we would love not to do this stuff. And as time goes on, you could wind up in a world where we move in the same way we did after Vietnam, or for that matter, after World War II. After World War II, we were good at high-end warfare, and then 5 years later, we couldn't even stop the North Koreans. It's amazing. We went from being by far the best military in the history of the planet in 1945. 5 short years later, we could not even stop the North Koreans, who at that time were a much smaller military than they are today, and certainly not a developed or sophisticated country. And yet we were unprepared for them. So we're pretty good at forgetting fast capabilities that we once had. And so that's what got me nervous, the cycle of history where we seem to go through this process every 20, 30 years of wanting to forego the kinds of capabilities that we only developed through a lot of difficulty and a lot of bloodshed in one conflict. We decide that conflict really wasn't advantageous to our interests, somehow persuade ourselves we're not going to have to face anything like it in the future, and then we're unprepared for the next one, which inevitably happens. So that's my initial starting point as to why I got worried and why I decided to write the book. Then part 2 of my talk, West Point. Very interesting vignette. And because this was just a month ago and, again, my previous talk to today's, I thought it might be a nice way to kick off the conversation with you as well. And so let me just explain to you what happened to me that it was pretty interesting. I asked the group of cadets, and it was probably, I guess, about 75 people in the audience. And these are cadets who are in the class of 2016, 17, 18, or 19, right? So they all came into West Point well after President Obama was president, well after we had had the big Iraq and Afghanistan surges, and even after that 2012 Defense Strategic Guidance had been issued, saying we're no longer going to do big, messy stuff. Again, we say the specific words were, we're not going to prepare for prolonged, large-scale stabilization missions. But what, to me, to put it in the vernacular, what that means is we're not going to do messy stuff, big messy stuff. Because stabilization missions, that's a category of operations that encompasses everything from counterinsurgency to complex humanitarian relief where there's some kind of violent resistance to a peace enforcement mission. And so that whole broad category of missions, President Obama had basically said to the nation and to the Pentagon, don't prepare for this so much anymore. So I asked the cadets what they thought. And I tried not to remind them. I didn't want them to feel like they were going to be contradicting their commander-in-chief while I asked this question. So I put it in somewhat different form. But I basically said to them, when you joined the military, as you did, depending on who you are, 1 or 2 or 3 years ago, and decided to come to West Point, and then you sort of looked ahead to your own career and what you thought you were most likely to do, what would be the defining operation, if there were going to be such a thing, the defining operation of your military career for whatever time you might envision staying in the U.S. Army after West Point, whether it's one tour, 5 years, or whether it's a whole career. And I said, how many of you think it's going to be sort of the good old-fashioned, high-end operational maneuver warfare, World War II style, Operation Desert Storm style, large tank battle, or maybe a modern variant that has a lot of robotics and integrated operations with technology. I mean, no one's trying to pretend that we're going to go back and fight the same old way. We're obviously going to use technology. So I said, how many of you think that it's going to be a big battle, whether it's against Vladimir Putin over Latvia, or whether it's, Kim Jong-un possibly aided by some of the Chinese over Korea, or something equivalent to that, or an invasion of Iran where we decide we've had enough of the Ayatollah and it's time to overthrow the regime there. Anyway, I said, how many of you think that's the kind of thing that may be your most challenging, most defining operation in your future Army career? And you got a few hands, maybe, a quarter of the room. And then I said, how many of you think it'll either be a lot of small messy things or one really big messy thing? And almost all the rest of the hands went up. And interestingly, they were basically saying, and I don't want to put words in their mouths or accuse them of insubordination. They were basically saying, however, they didn't quite buy what President Obama had put into those documents, because they expected that whatever the current guidance was, either it would change or it would not be able to affect the reality that the world is going to present us with big, messy stuff that we're going to have to do, even if we had no intention in the first place. And by the way, I'm being slightly dramatic here, because if you read those documents, President Obama was smart enough to leave a little bit of wiggle room. So there still is, a nod to the fact that, yeah, we should have the capabilities in the Army, that we could build back up some of these capabilities if we needed to. But there is no intention of sustaining them at anywhere near the current level. In the short term, by the way, I don't see this as a big danger, because we have so much resident expertise in our armed forces, not just in the Army, of course, but across all four services, in the intelligence community, in the Department of Homeland Security. We have a lot of knowledge and experience in dealing with these kinds of operations. We all know how much we've asked of our men and women in uniform. So in the short term, we're not going to lose this expertise, at least among the more veteran, the more senior individuals in the armed forces. But the people we're starting to bring in now, the 18 and 20 and 22-year-olds, what message are we going to tell them about the kind of preparations they need to focus on? And sure, it would be nice to have them only be able to worry about one specific, almost semi-sanitary kind of conflict where there's no complex politics and there's no complex, peacekeeping or stabilization. I just don't believe it's credible. And so it seems like at least that group of cadets agreed with me. For whatever purpose that serves, let me just make that observation to you. Now let me wrap up in this opening by talking a little bit about why I feel this way. And to some extent, I want to throw a couple of scenarios at you, but I don't want to go through them in detail. I develop 10 of them in my book. Although in the interest of full disclosure, let me tell you, we did a book launch at Brookings that Carrie and Valentina and some other my friends who are here today put together beautifully. And I was lucky because my former classmate and Deb Friedman's former classmate, David Petraeus, who was in graduate school with us, was willing to do this event with me. And David Ignatius kindly interviewed the two of us, talking about not just the book, but the subject of the future of land warfare. And so Petraeus got the microphone, and in his classic trash-talking way, he said, "Yeah, Mike's got these 10 scenarios, and one or two of them are even credible." But even he said, and he said this with a big smile on his face, so I wasn't sure if I should take the teasing as a joke or not. But in any event, clearly he fundamentally agrees with the bottom line. He said in his farewell speech when he was retiring from the military in the summer of 2011, the phrase that I then took and picked up on and brought in the old Trotsky element to it. You may not have an interest in war, but war may have an interest in you. You may not have a big interest in big, messy stuff, but we may find that our national security is significantly impinged by some such operations or the requirement to carry out some such missions. And as much as we might want our allies to do it, or the locals to handle it, or to close our eyes and hope that it stays contained wherever it is, it may not always be a realistic option for any of those things to play out. So I'm not going to go through all my scenarios in detail, but let me just talk about a couple, three categories of concerns I have, and then I'll stop and look forward to your thoughts and questions. One category of concern, and on this one I guess I will be a little bit geographically specific, is South Asia, and not so much Afghanistan, but India and Pakistan. And so what I'm worried about is here you've got a witch's brew of close to 2 billion people, and also some pretty deep structural conflicts between the two countries, but also a lot of people depending on a pretty rickety infrastructure for survival in a context of a lot of political violence, especially in Pakistan, and the potential for a very difficult environment if you ever start to have a big meltdown of one type or another. And the question would be not so much would the U.S. Army go in to save the day by invading, but would the world find the need to try to respond with some kind of a multinational operation of some type or another. Let me give you a couple examples of what I'm worried about. Okay, so our Pakistani friends, God bless them in their wisdom, are currently building a couple of nuclear power plants just west of Karachi. Now, I hope they do a nice job building these, because one of the last places on earth I'd ever want to see a nuclear power plant melt down is just west of Karachi. Because think of what could be involved in the aftermath of that. This could be the need to evacuate one of the world's megacities, 20 million people, in a place where there are a lot of gangs, a lot of extremist groups, a lot of jihadists, a lot of people who hate the United States, but also people who hate India, and who hate their own government. And by the way, let's remember this is a government that has 100 nuclear weapons. Who is watching those 100 nuclear weapons? Whenever you ask a U.S. government official in public testimony to say, how do you feel about the security of Pakistan's nuclear stockpile, they always give the same answer, which is designed to be reassuring, which is, I feel good about it. And I'd be curious as to how Bob Einhorn and a few others who have studied this problem feel about it. I don't feel so good about it. We don't always keep good track of our own nuclear arsenal. Remember a few years ago when we had 5 or 6 of them that wound up in the wrong airfield and we didn't find out for a little bit later. The idea that Pakistan has this super dependable group of special, Jedi warriors who are divorced from the rest of the problems afflicting their country and able to just purely focus in on that country's nuclear arsenal and its stability, I don't buy for a second. They're going to have the same tensions in whatever elite force are keeping guard of their nuclear arsenal as they have in all the rest of their military and their society. And sure, they can try to vet that group, they can try to find the best people, but this is still a human institution, and human institutions fail. So you compound that reality with the potential for some kind of a disaster. Or if you don't like my natural disaster scenario, let's go to an Indo-Pakistani conflict. And I think here, hopefully I don't have to work too hard to persuade you that there is a real chance that this kind of a thing could happen, since there have already been, depending on how you count, somewhere between 3 and 6 in the last 75 years. And most recently, of great concern, actually there have been a couple other smaller incidents since, but in 2008, you'll all recall the Mumbai attacks, when a group, Lashkar-e-Taiba, that essentially was created by the Pakistani state, which was then facilitated in its operations by the Pakistani state. A lot of the surveillance that went on was done with the active help of the Pakistani state, basically pulled a ISIS-style attack on Mumbai. And what's stunning about that is, first of all, that Pakistan as an official entity would actually try to make that happen, or at least, some parts of the Pakistani government would have an interest in making that happen. But also what's stunning to me is that India did not respond militarily. What's interesting is, first of all, hats off to the Indians. What incredible restraint. But the other point, do you really think they'd be restrained the next time? I'm pretty confident the answer is no. In fact, they've said the answer is no. And so let's say Lashkar-e-Taiba does another Mumbai. And let's say it's not even this time with the active aid and encouragement of the Pakistani establishment. Maybe the Pakistani government has decided this is not smart, but now they've created a Frankenstein's monster they can no longer control. Except India's not going to believe that when the day after the attack, Pakistan tries to get out of its responsibility by saying, we didn't actually do this, we didn't encourage it, we didn't support it, even though we had done so the last time. And so what is India going to do? India, in my opinion, is going to do a military reprisal of some kind. The question is, can they get away with a very limited reprisal, and is that where it ends? Or do we start to see that when India gets even 20, 30 miles inside of Pakistan, which is a very narrow country, that very quickly Pakistan considers its regime survival to be at stake and starts to trot out these nuclear weapons that it has produced at huge expense, especially relative to its own GDP, and tries to see if it can't get some benefit out of the possession of these nuclear weapons through the old kind of nuclear brinkmanship that, if you think this is crazy, don't forget we used to do it all the time ourselves. We would figure out, in fact, you could argue we just did it this week by flying B-52s over Korea, but I don't think we try to make that seem too nuclear. But in the old days, we did. And we try, in a big crisis with the Soviets, we tried to make it clear that we were putting nuclear forces on higher alert. So where does this stop? Does it stop in a happy place? I guess everybody reads the history of the Cold War and nuclear crises differently. I read it to think we had a lot of close calls. And I don't want to see them repeated around the world. I think India and Pakistan could easily have one. The point is not to, how do I link this to ground war? The way I link it is, if we get to a point where the two sides are on the verge of using nuclear weapons against each other, what's the world going to do at that point? I think what the world would have to do is ask the UN Secretary General, or maybe the UN Secretary General plus the American president and the head of the European Union foreign policy operation, to basically say to leaders in Delhi and Islamabad, listen, stop it. The world cannot afford a nuclear war in your part of, your densely populated area of South Asia. And in order to deal with the causes of this conflict, we are going to offer the deployment of a multinational stabilization force to improve border security between the two, to reduce the odds of future kinds of crossovers of terrorists, and also perhaps to do some kind of a trusteeship for Kashmir, and then ultimately allow people in Kashmir, which has been the sort of casus belli in Pakistan's mind of all these conflicts, to choose their own future at some date 10, 20 years in the future. Anyway, now I'm getting into my scenarios. I promised I wouldn't, so let me stop there. But I worry about these kinds of things, which are individually unlikely, perhaps, but collectively, if you look at a lot of different ones around the world, I think we'll probably wind up over a 10-year time frame having to do one or two or three things like this. Now I'm just going to mention two last ones, but in brief, and then stop. One of them I think we actually will do. This one I think is likely, and it's some kind of a multinational operation in Syria. I don't think we're going to invade to try to do, the third incarnation of a big regime change operation. But I think as an international community, at some point, we're going to recognize that what's needed is some kind of a equivalent to the Bosnia operation, once we can negotiate a confederal arrangement among the different warring parties. Because John Kerry right now is trying to negotiate peace in Vienna with all these different parties. And what he's after essentially, and this, he might object if he heard this phrase or this description, but I think this is what he's doing. He's looking for a self-enforcing ceasefire among basically 50 to 100 groups that hate each other and have no trust for each other. It is not going to self-enforce. Even if these groups would agree to a peace, and I don't think they will, I believe it would fall apart very quickly. So the only way I think we're going to have success in Syria is to, first of all, strengthen the moderate elements, which is going to take things like special forces. So I'm not trying to dismiss other tools of our military. But ultimately, you're going to need to work to a peace deal, a confederal arrangement, probably Alawites in one part of the country and Sunnis in another and Kurds in a third and maybe Druze in a fourth. And then an international presence that could include Russians and Americans and Turks and many others will deploy to try to monitor and in some cases enforce it. I don't see any other alternative. And I think we'll probably do this sort of thing towards the end of the decade, maybe 2-3 years into the next president's term, be my prediction. Again, I hope I'm wrong. I hope there's some other magical way that appears to solve this thing. I just don't see it. Very last category of scenarios, and I'll just stop with this. As you all know, we have more than 7 billion people on the planet. We're headed towards 10 billion plus or minus by mid-century. These people, the good news is we're living better. A lot of people are living better. This has been the most important period for fighting poverty, bringing people out of despair in human history, and there are a lot more people living under better governance, democratic governance in many cases. The bad news is we're going to have 10 billion people depending on this incredibly fragile global infrastructure where we're all interconnected. We're taking airplanes all over the place and infecting each other. We are trying to elevate living standards on top of electricity grids and other kind of infrastructure that are vulnerable to 1,000 disruptions that could happen to them. And the world is going to have a lot more people living in potential risk of catastrophe. And I think one of the things we did in the research for the book was to look at a lot of the humanitarian relief operations the U.S. has contributed to in the last 20 years, whether it's the 2004 tsunami or the 2012 tsunami in Japan, or some of the Pakistani earthquakes, or the typhoon in the Philippines a couple of years ago, the Haiti earthquake. What tended to be the pattern was that maybe 2 to 3 to 4 million people were affected acutely by these tragedies. And that was a lot. But you know what? It could be 10 times worse when one of these things hits a megacity. And so as the world increases in population, and I say 10 times worse precisely, that's roughly the increased magnitude of the devastation that I would predict that will happen at some point when a megacity just happens to be in the path of something horrible like one of these giant earthquakes, typhoons, or what have you. So I'm not basing my whole argument about the need for ground forces on the idea that we're going to have a lot of future land battles that resemble World War II and, Rommel and all that kind of stuff. I'm not saying that it's going to be all about classic high-end warfare. A lot of this is going to be complex humanitarian relief. And some of it is going to be very directly affecting our security in places that directly affect our security, because either the countries will own nuclear weapons, and we can't afford to see those seep out, or there'll be some kind of a health crisis on top of the political unrest. Imagine if the Ebola crisis broke out in northern Nigeria near Boko Haram, for example, instead of being in the relatively more containable place like Liberia and Guinea where it was. So these are the kinds of scenarios that I don't think are going to happen tomorrow. Any one of them is individually unlikely, even over a 20 or 30-year time frame. But when you put it all together, and then you also add in, and I'm just going to mention this in passing, the traditional needs for deterrence in Korea, the eastern flank of NATO, and other such missions that can't be forgotten, even though I've not talked about them so far today. This adds up to, in my mind, the need for a U.S. Army and a U.S. Marine Corps that are basically at least as big as they are today. This is not ultimately an uber hawk argument for growing the Army back to Cold War levels. Other people may come to that conclusion, and I look forward to seeing if some of you do. And there is an argument for it to grow. But I actually don't make an argument for it to grow in the book. I just think we've cut enough. And the kind of people who say cut it another 25 or 50% because we're tired of this kind of combat, I think they're ignoring this whole range of factors and this whole set of scenarios that could actually make us really regret any such decision if we carry it out. So thanks for your patience, and I'll stop there and look forward to your thoughts. We're using microphones, so feel free to get in line or whatever you'd like.
Thank you. First off, thank you for writing this. It's a good start, especially here in this town where you have a president eager to run out the clock and a Congress that just doesn't seem to care about this stuff hard enough. So thank you. I've started to read your book. I haven't gotten all the way through it. You mentioned the South Asia scenarios. There was one scenario that I noted in your book that you said that you didn't game out with the number of troops that would be needed. That would be the exchange of nuclear weapons, the mass exchange, if you will, between India and Pakistan, that you didn't put in the book. Did you game out this scenario in yourself, and you just didn't put it in the book, or did you just not bother? Because I was just curious. It's a good book, by the way.
Thank you. What I did with the book was I'm gonna interpret your question to mean that there are scenarios in South Asia that could be much, much worse than what I even conjured up, and I would agree with that. So, for example, in my book, I did not assume, in my scenario, I did not assume that there would be a lot of American forces or any multinational forces contributing to large-scale humanitarian relief in the aftermath of the nuclear devastation. Obviously, if the war got to the point where you had, 10 weapons exchanged on a side against cities, you could have a massive humanitarian problem. And the Indian and Pakistani armies, even if they were fully cooperative, would not be up to the task of handling that. But I didn't even look at that. I looked at the issue of how would you try to prevent another infiltration of a Lashkar-e-Taiba group from one side of the border to the other, and also maybe take Kashmir and put it in a different kind of political setting. If we had any Indian friends here today, they'd be looking to excoriate me for that. But if you get to the point of nuclear exchange, it might look a little different to them, I think. And if there could be some kind of a face-saving way to take the issue into the future and say, let's have an international trusteeship for a decade. The international community will run Kashmir with Kashmiris, obviously. It will police Kashmir. Indian and Pakistani forces should back out. And after that 10-year period, there could be a referendum on its future political status. That's what I tried to size. And even that mission could be pretty darn demanding. Several tens of thousands of U.S. troops as part of a coalition. I'm assuming for most of these operations that I look at, the U.S. share would be anywhere from a quarter to half of the total ground forces, preferably towards the lower end. And there certainly, are a lot of soldiers around the world. There are about 20 million people in uniform around the world from all countries. About 15 million of them are soldiers. Our military is about 1.3 million active duty. Just under 500,000 are soldiers. So we have a much smaller percentage of soldiers. And even if you add the Marines Our total ground force capabilities are about half of our military, whereas for the world as a whole, it's about three-fourths. Most countries emphasize their armies. So you could say, well, why wouldn't other countries contribute the majority? The problem is in some of these complex situations that require not just firepower, but also logistics. It's really only the U.S. military that can deploy to a very remote or stressed or violent area quickly and support an operation that may encompass not just peacekeeping, but humanitarian relief and other things. Anyway, so there are ways to make this scenario even more demanding. By the way, a U.S. Army of 500,000 with Marines another 180,000 or so in the active force, this is very modest relative not only to our history, but relative to the size of the populations around the world that we could be trying to help police. And if you go to the Petraeus, Mattis, Amos criteria from their counterinsurgency manual in 2006, they basically said that for a country of 25 to 30 million like Iraq or Afghanistan, you basically need 500,000 people to police it. Hopefully some of them could be indigenous, and a lot of them could be non-American foreign forces. But these are the kind of numbers. This is the tyranny of the math, which means that any big country, any really big country, Indonesia, India, China, Brazil, we're not even in the ballpark of being able to stabilize those, even if we got most of the world to go with us. So again, I'm living within these constraints. I'm not advocating for some huge army relative to any and all possible scenarios.
Thank you.
Thank you.
If I can ask a big question and a tiny question. The big question is the big question is not intended to be argumentative. It may sound that way when you first hear it, but you talk about the capacity for stabilization. You're worrying that it's going to fall off. When would you say that U.S. capacity was at its peak, and what would you give as an example of the best it could do? So that's a big question. Little question. I come from another country which is said to punch above its weight, said to be your closest ally. Mr. Cameron, when he came in, worried many of us by cutting Britain's defence capacity significantly. He now seems to be doing a U-turn in his new term of office. How seriously do you take that U-turn? How useful are you going to be?
Thanks for the questions. Yes, so the British Army, before this latest U-turn, although I'm not, as you probably know, it's not quite a U-turn, the British Army was headed to be only 80,000 active duty soldiers, which was less than half the size of our Marine Corps. And even if you adjust for relative population of the UK versus the United States, this is sort of punching below your weight compared to where you've been historically, and at least. And this is one of the conundrums for us, because certainly Britain, South Korea, Australia, Canada, a couple others would be, in my mind, in our top tier of military partners abroad. But their ability, they're fantastic allies, you're fantastic allies, but the collective capacity of all these allies together is quite modest. And so the question is, since we can't just browbeat and berate our allies to do more, we try, and it doesn't tend to work. And even with Cameron in the latest, it's not going to be a big shift, I don't believe. This leaves us in a dilemma that in a given mission, typically our only real major partners that are going to help are going to be the local allies, and to some limited extent, Britain, Australia, Canada, and maybe one or two others. So in Afghanistan, for example, where, think about Afghanistan for a minute. Barack Obama comes into the White House. The Europeans love Obama, right? I mean, this is the guy they've been waiting for, and he's getting 80% popularity all across Europe. This is the kind of American president they want to support. 8 years before, with a president they wound up loving less, George W. Bush, they still were willing to invoke NATO's Article 5 commitment of mutual self-defense after the 9/11 attacks. But even under Obama, and even with that Article 5 applying to Afghanistan and the mission there, the Europeans collectively never deployed more than about 30% the number of troops that we had. So this was the good war with the good Obama as America's president. Europe wanting to do whatever they could to help, and there still wasn't that much capacity. I don't think Cameron's going to change that reality. Angela Merkel's not changing that reality. What you tend to see in Afghanistan these days, the biggest troop contributors, actually the Germans are doing more than I would have expected, but it's still 800 people, that sort of thing. And the biggest contributors are often the Georgians or others who are trying to cement their political relationship with the United States, may or may not have the capacity inherently of Britain. So that's my thinking about allies. I love the fact that we have this amazing set of alliances We are extremely fortunate. There's been nothing like it in history, and yet the collective capacity of all of our allies combined, except for those immediately affected by a given war, is going to be probably 25 to 35% of what we can deliver. And that's just going to be a structural reality. On the issue of our stabilization capability, I know there are people here who have thought about this or done this, and so they may want to, I invite them when they get to the microphone to answer your question as well. But I would tend to say it was sort of late Bush, early Obama years. And you could say even when we got good at it, you know, we still couldn't produce magic. I would say we did pretty well in the Iraq surge and pretty well in the Afghanistan surge, but they were obviously fragile accomplishments and of limited durability. I think things could be worse in those countries than they are, but for the amount of effort we put in, it's frustrating. So if you said it wasn't, your question wasn't argumentative, but I'm glad that it was skeptical in a sense. And I think we do have to recognize that in many of these missions, we're not going to get perfectly clean victories, but sometimes the alternative of letting things fall apart is no better or actually much worse.
I note that you did not use democratization but stabilization, which I presume you explained in the book. One thing, your conclusions are pretty much good, but I wonder if you've considered all the aspects in as much depth as you might. If we consider mammograms, what's dangerous about mammograms? It's really not the radiation effect on the woman so much. It's that you can get a bunch of false positives that lead you off doing things that you shouldn't be doing. And so the thought is, if we build up this capability, I would assume we'll be more wanting to use this capability, and we might get ourselves dragged into, we think about the Iraq War and how unhappy we are about that. And so that scares me a little bit. Yeah. So in what ways can we prevent the false positives of, we really ought to do this, and a year later we say, my God, why did we do that?
No, it's an excellent question. And well, first of all, let me give two answers. The first answer would be, historically, if you look at our nation's history, I do not see a correlation between higher likelihood of fighting when we're better prepared militarily. Often we have wound up fighting when we weren't prepared militarily, and in fact, deterrence failure was often a big contributor to the reason we wound up getting involved at all. So the World Wars, the Korean War, these are cases where I think underpreparedness was the bigger problem, not overpreparedness. So that would be a part of my answer to your question. Another part would be that there probably were wars where if we hadn't had a big military, we wouldn't have gotten as involved, and Iraq may be an example, and Vietnam may be an example. So you're right, there is this danger. It has to be compared to the opposite danger of being underprepared and having deterrence fail. But I think the best response is just how much we Americans love to debate each other and express our views about given wars, and how passionate we are, for obvious reason, because people's lives are at stake, about these conflicts. And what we have to do is make sure that the passion that we've had about Iraq after the fact, that we can generate that kind of passion in a debate before the next war, rather than sort of lamenting what we got into afterwards. So, this, there's no easy answer. The main thing is that Congress needs to have a major say in any decision on the use of force, because that's the way in which the debate becomes public, and the country as a whole can feel like it's part of it. And I'm not necessarily arguing now for a new authorization on the use of military force against ISIL, because I actually think the existing one is a pretty clear embodiment of what we need in terms of authorities. But in a hypothetical new big war, I think the congressional role is crucial. And the kind of way we debate each other just has to be sustained. And we have to remember history. So the next time around, we'll have to remember how we all felt in 01 and 02. And there was just a little too much inclination, not only to invade Iraq, because maybe I'm partly guilty of that too, but also to think that it could be easy. And I was not guilty of that. But Rumsfeld and a few others were. They tried to portray that as a cakewalk, if you'll recall. And so I think we need to remember that when we do these things, they're often going to be very hard, and really only get to them as a last resort. Not necessarily last in terms of time or chronology, but last in terms of, is there any better way to do this before we have to go in big? And so in that sense, maybe it sounds like I'm arguing against my own book, but I do think that these kind of missions will occasionally be necessary, but we should make them as rare as we possibly can, and informed debate, public debate, congressional debate are the best ways.
Great, thank you.
Thank you.
I appreciate your comments about losing the lessons after each war. I like the saying that the recurring themes in military history are the recurring themes in military history, where we continue to relearn the same lessons.
Yeah.
And so I guess it comes down to a question of resources. I mean, Desert Storm 1 was probably a way we want to fight American war. High technology, high intensity combat, lots of tanks and air and coordinated ground-air operations and things like that. That's not what we're going to see in the future, partly because I think of our success in Desert Storm 1. How do we reconcile our culture, our ground forces culture of wanting to fight those full spectrum operations with what's going to be required for these ambiguous urban complex situations involving civilians, involving crumbling infrastructure, tribal, clan strife, kind of the complexity and ambiguity that SOF gets sent to deal with, because they have folks that train to deal with that type of environment. And so that requires a heavy investment in leaders, a diffusion of decision making down to the staff sergeant and lieutenant level, and a huge investment in people. And so it's all about resources. And so how do we reconcile how we like to fight or how we want to fight with what we may need to fight in the future?
Thank you. And by the way, I'm glad you mentioned Desert Storm, because next Sunday, I believe, is the 25th anniversary of its initiation. So as the Redskins beat up on the Carolina Panthers next Sunday, I don't know which author will be speaking about the launching of Desert Storm, if you're going to try to time something to that. But yeah, very well said. Although, of course, Desert Storm didn't solve all our problems, which is part of why we wound up 12 years later with the conundrum that the sanctions that we had built up after Desert Storm seemed to be eroding. The no-fly zones had been very difficult and draining. We were hated in the Arab world then, too, for our presence with, airmen and others in the Saudi kingdom, the home of Mecca and Medina, and it didn't seem like a very sustainable path we were on then either.
But fighting a uniform opposing army in the field,
yes,
I think
that part people would have preferred. Again, my good friend Barry Huggins and others here who have, done a lot more in real life on this kind of stuff than I have may shudder the way I'm going to simplify my answer to your question, your main question. But the way I think of it is when an 18-year-old goes into the military today, and that's the person I'm trying to think about, the new recruit who doesn't even remember 9/11, and barely remembers some of the key milestones in the Iraq War. That person, I think, needs to have two basic types of training. Dave Petraeus says he needs to be a pentathlete. He or she needs to be a pentathlete. And that's Petraeus' phrase. So that's 5 different things, right? But to me, it's 2 broad categories. There are a lot of things within each of the 2. But I'm trying to keep it simple. One category is high-end warfare. How do you operate your weapons? How do you fight as part of a combined team? And everything from marksmanship to small unit tactics to integrating with air power and everything in between is part of that. And that should probably be 3/4 of the training. But the other 1/4 has to be about complex situations where restraint in the use of force is just as important as identifying the enemy. And there are a lot of different tactical ways you can train for that. And I'm not going to presume to be able to answer that question in detail. But it seems to me central that 18-year-old recruit has to be thinking about this category of missions from day one, and not thinking of it as a secondary or derivative or now frowned upon set of distractions. In fact, ironically, because Democrats historically have been more willing to do nation building and peacekeeping than Republicans, ironically, what that 18-year-old needs to do is not listen to President Obama, but listen to Secretary Rumsfeld's last directive on this subject, because DoD Directive 3000-05, which was issued in 2005, said that stabilization and such missions are now of an equal priority to classic warfighting in Defense Department doctrine. And I'm not saying they have to be an equal amount of the time of that 18-year-old's recruit's training regimen, but I think they need to be a substantial chunk. And if you get into that person's head from day one, that there are a lot of missions in which not shooting is going to be every bit as important as shooting, I think you're off in the right direction. And then we can have all the specific debates about, which war colleges and how big your specialized capabilities need to be for a given part of the world and foreign area officers. We can get into all those debates at a nitty-gritty level. But that 18-year-old recruit needs to be thinking about both categories of missions from the first day he or she puts on the uniform. That's my basic answer.
Sir, along with the military, the Army, I know, is going to be cutting about 30,000 active troops this year. There's also talk of Guard and Reserve taking on a much bigger role, Guardsmen serving for about 90 days a year, potentially, as opposed to the normal month or so, as well as moving active duty components under Guard command structures. And in the kind of contingency operations you were discussing, do you think that that is going to be a long-term sustainable model to be so reliant on part-time soldiers as we have been for the war on terror?
You know, it's a real interesting question, and I'm sure those of you who have been close to this, you know that it's often an acrimonious topic. So the active Army, the Guard and Reserve, especially the National Guard versus the active Army, often are at loggerheads. And they get angry with each other, and they're fighting over budget share. And most recently, the active Army wanted to put all the Apache helicopters into the active force and put the Black Hawks into the National Guard, because the Black Hawks, as important as they are in battle, can also be used in domestic response and humanitarian emergency. So it seemed to make more sense to have them in the National Guard, but of course the Guard took that as an affront to their warfighting capability and another indication that the active Army didn't take them seriously. This stuff gets pretty ugly more often than it probably should. We already have, I think, a very nicely balanced active, reserve, National Guard. So, as some of you will surely know, our reservists in the Army are more numerous than our active duty soldiers. We have more people between the Army National Guard and the Army Reserve wearing the uniform than we do in the active duty force. It's roughly comparable, but it's a little bit more in the reserve component broadly defined. And a lot of those reservists were in the active force at one time. And so some people are saying, let's dramatically increase the size of the Guard, dramatically scale back the active Army. I don't think that's a good idea. I think a lot of the missions we need to be able to carry out, you need a quick, credible deterrent capability or response capability. And also, where is the Guard and Reserve? Where are they going to find these soldiers if they don't have a stream of a lot of people leaving the active force and willing to join? It's about 50-50 right now, or has been 50-50 in terms of where the Guard and Reserve get their recruits. And I think that's a nice ratio that works pretty well. My bottom line is I'm sort of a conservative on this, in the sense that I think the current balance works reasonably well. And anybody who's making a big argument to radically shift needs to have the burden of proof on them. I don't favor going to a much higher reliance on part-time soldiers, but I think part-time soldiers do a great job on a lot of missions. I'll finish on this point with your question. I'm still not sure how well the National Guard did in Iraq and Afghanistan at the brigade level, at the highest echelon. And I think there is still a need for better research about that. And frankly, the Army's not getting after this question well enough. I think they're too afraid of it. And they realize that internally it's going to create a lot of political fights. But they actually need to help the rest of us think it through. And I think it might actually calm down some passions if we see that, we see a lot of additional evidence from this kind of a study. We could never have fought these wars without the reserve component. But asking the National Guard brigades to be as good across the whole realm of capabilities as the active brigades, that may be a bridge too far, at least in the early going of a future war. But I think we need more data about that.
Michael, looks like we have 2 or 3 more questions in about 5 minutes.
Okay, so maybe I'll take all the questions and then try to wrap up succinctly. Is that okay? Brad, please.
Yes, thank you for your comments. You mentioned that the ratio of Army Marines in the U.S. is a different ratio than you see in other countries. Do you think that ratio needs to change for the future?
Thank you. Robert.
Mike, I agree with your thesis that we need to retain the capability to engage in these messy, large counterinsurgency stabilization operations. But I don't think your examples were the scenarios persuaded me that we needed that capability. I think I would have looked for other examples. I mean, I think of, retaking Mosul, defeating ISIS, helping the rebels, topple Bashar al-Assad. Those are the kinds of big, messy operations I think we may have to engage in the future, and maybe you could discuss some of those. I mean, for example, the South Asia scenario, as someone who's worked on South Asia a lot, I can't conceive of the Indians agreeing to interpose, because they'll figure the ISI will support further terrorist operations and we won't be able to respond across the international border. And Kashmir is Indian territory according to the Indians, and they won't permit an international force. Anyway, but even if you look at scenarios where international peace enforcing or peacekeeping forces would be necessary. I think you probably can field those forces, consistent with President Obama's, 2014 guidance. Anyway.
Yeah, fair point. And Barry.
Dr.
Good to see
Hanlon, thanks for coming out on Sunday. I infer from your opening remarks that we may be on the cusp of another deterrence failure. Some combination of a demonstrated lack of willingness in our 2012 and 2014 publicly promulgated strategic documents, and the potential for a loss of capability in the ground forces. Now, you've addressed the second half, obviously, and made a compelling case. To what extent, though, do you think future strategic documents need to be a little more explicit about, or alternatively, be a little more strategically ambiguous, so that we don't explicitly write off certain mission sets, certain peninsulas off the Asian mainland, whatever it might be?
Yeah, thank you. Maybe I'll go in reverse order because on this issue of documents, I remember debating Bill Kristol about the President Bush's national security strategy from 2002, and this was about a dozen years ago. And I think I surprised Kristol because the first thing I said was, I read this thing and it's actually pretty interesting. It's pretty good. It's almost too good. Because the argument about the potential utility of preemption or preemptive force or preventive war, theoretically, it's hard to disagree with. Now, applying it to Iraq is a different matter, and maybe that was a mistake. But it was a fascinating willingness to actually break China in a doctrinal document, and it probably got Bush into more trouble in the end than it helped him. So the scholar in me, the reader in me, enjoyed the fact that I was reading a national security strategy that didn't bore me to death. But in the broad sweep of things, it was almost too good, if you see what I mean, almost too interesting. So I think the next quadrennial defense review doesn't have to repudiate what President Obama said in building it. Now getting to also Bob's point, I just think it needs to basically, find a different set of words. So, okay, we're not going to do a big, prolonged, large-scale stabilization mission, but we could have to do complex humanitarian relief, peace enforcement, restoration of Allied control of certain key cities where they, like Mosul, where they can't do it themselves. There's a whole range of things, and some of them could be big, some of them could be small. By the way, I also think this two-war framework has sort of outlived its usefulness. It had some simplifying utility after the end of the Cold War, but I think now we're more likely to wind up needing to deter one big conflict like Korea and do 3 or 4 or 5 different types of things of varying magnitudes and durations, and probably need an analytical framework that acknowledges that. So that gets sort of to your one of your points again, Bob, as well. And yeah, I mean, I had 10 scenarios in my book. Today I talked mostly about the ones that are not warfighting oriented, but you're right. The ones that you alluded to are not in the book, and maybe the next book we do together we should put them in. But of course, the dilemma about scenarios. It's that what you're trying to do is keep people partly engaged and suspending a little bit of disbelief, but and I think maybe you're right that a few scenarios that are a little closer to today's world would help people see a more tangible path forward. That's why I had the serious scenario. I thought it was important to talk about that. So a point well taken. On India and South Asia, you know it much better than I do, and everything you ever write and say I take very seriously. But I also, on this one, think that, again, trying to suspend disbelief, I'm trying to imagine a world where nuclear weapons have gone off. And I know you think a lot about that, too, in your career. What would a world be like after the bomb had gone off? And I just think a lot of assumptions could change, especially when there's the possibility of yet more bombs being shot back and forth if we don't find some way to stop it. So it's in that context that I really think a big operation in South Asia might be contemplated. And I'm not trying to predict that it would definitely be welcomed in the first instance. I just think there's a range of circumstances under which the world could look a lot different, even to Indian diplomats who are jealous about their sovereignty over Kashmir and their desire to be able to retaliate over the line of control against Pakistan. And then, but point well taken. No one scenario has to be totally compelling. I had one where I said, again, in northeast Nigeria, imagine Ebola plus Boko Haram, plus a worsening sectarian conflict. 3 things, all of which are totally credible because they're all there in different parts of the region. Just imagine them all coming together at once in northeastern Nigeria. I don't know if that kind of a scenario is more or less credible to people. So I try to get at the imagination question in different ways. On the very last point, and I'll stop. No, I don't have any argument that we need a lot more ground forces relative to the size of the military than we have today. I'm just nervous about the trend in the other direction. And for those who don't join me in the nervousness or wonder why, beyond these sort of arcane Pentagon documents that probably half of you had never even heard of, or hopefully for your sake hadn't read in any event, a guy I really, really admire. I think he's one of the brightest modern American officers that I've ever had the privilege of getting to know, Admiral Gary Roughead, who was the Chief of Naval Operations through 2011. He wrote a paper, published through Brookings, in fact, but I didn't bless it, although we were honored to have him write for Brookings, in which he called for the Army to basically be cut in half. And this was after all the cuts that have already happened. So the Army's already 20% smaller than it was at the peak of Iraq and Afghanistan. I'm okay with that. I'm not okay with it being cut by 50% more. And so, again, we can get into all the details and the numbers and so forth. But I'm basically trying, it's not always the most dramatic way to write a book when you're just trying to sort of preserve the past, make a passionate case for the status quo. But what I'm worried about is not so much that we need to reverse the cuts, but we need to make sure they don't go a lot further. And with that, I'll stop and say, go Redskins. Thanks for coming out today.